Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Kuo, and today we'll begin part 1 of our lecture series on digestive system. There are 3 videos that you can pause our video to take a look at first before you proceed. Now we'll begin by taking a look at the review of anatomy related to digestive organs. So the function of our digestive system is to process food so that it can absorb the nutrients within the food and use those as energy for the cells of our body. And so the organs and the structures of our digestive system fall under 2 groups. Organs that are directly part of the alimentary canal, also known as GI tract, or organs that are considered accessory digestive organs. So GI tract includes the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, so all 3 segments of the small intestine, all 3 segments of our large intestine, including also the sigmoid column and rectum as well. Okay, and then the anal canal. So that muscular tube that spans throughout from the mouth to the anus, that's alimentary canal. Okay, and there are other organs that assist in the process of digestive process. That includes our gallbladder, the liver, pancreas, okay, the teeth, okay, salivary glands, okay, all 3 salivary glands, as well as the tongue. There are several digestive processes that can be found throughout the digestive tract. We have ingestion, which is taking in food, or in simpler terms, eating. There's propulsion, which is moving the food through the GI tract. Okay, and we see that inside the esophagus, inside the stomach, as well as throughout our intestines. Okay. And peristalsis is a special type of movement where the food is actually moved through an alternating wave of muscular contraction and relaxation. Okay, and that is oftentimes compared to a different process called segmentation, in which the food is actually moved forward and backward, and there's mixing motions happening, and this mixing isn't something we find with peristalsis. So segmentation functions to mechanically mix the food substance into a more homogeneous mixture, and also helps with mechanical breakdown of the food into smaller pieces that's more easily digestible when later that food substance encounters the chemical enzymes. So as you can see here, our esophagus only carries out propulsion. It doesn't do any of that segmentation, which is a form of mechanical breakdown. Okay, whereas small intestine, okay, we see a combination of both segmentation as well as propulsion happening. Same thing with our stomach, both propulsion as well as segmentation is happening. Okay, or both peristalsis and segmentation. Okay, and other forms of mechanical breakdown that allows larger food to be broken down into smaller pieces include chewing with our teeth and the churning motion of our stomach. As we'll see later, our stomach contains 3 layers of muscles. unlike the rest of our digestive tract, which only has 2 muscle layers, stomach has 3. So that churning motion of your stomach assists in the mechanical breakdown of food. Okay. Finally, we have digestion. So even though all these are referred to as digestive processes, but digestion as a term is generally used to refer to chemical breakdown. Okay, so using enzymes or other chemicals to break those already small food pieces into from larger molecules into smaller molecules. Okay. And then we have absorption, which is basically the passage of those digestive fragments of food from the GI tract into the lymph. Or in the case of fat, it's absorbed into lymphatic vessels. And at last, we have defecation, which is eliminating the indigestible substances via the anus in the form of feces. Okay, and that includes some of the fibers that we eat, like cellulose. Here's a video contrasting peristalsis and segmentation. So please pause our lecture video and take a look at it. So the term digestion is usually used to refer to chemical digestion, which is a series of catabolic reactions that involves digestive enzymes breaking down complex food molecules into chemical building blocks. So carbohydrate is basically simple sugars linked together, okay, into a big molecule. But this can be broken down and to yield smaller molecules in the form of simple sugar. Proteins are polymers of amino acids. So we can see amino acids as building blocks for proteins. And similarly, monoglycerides and fats combined together yields lipids. And so lipids can be broken down into these monomers. And these monomers are the ones that are then absorbed through the digestive tract into blood or into lymphatic vessels. Another great video, please take a look at this before you proceed with our lecture. Now we'll begin looking at each of the digestive organs in more detail, starting with the start of our digestive tract with our mouth. The saliva inside our mouth has a multitude of functions, including cleaning our mouth, so inhibiting bacterial growth, dissolving food chemicals for taste, moistening the food and compacting it into a bolus for ease of swallowing. And also, it contains amylase for initiating the breakdown of starch, which is a form of carbohydrate. Taking a look at the composition of saliva, we see that it's almost entirely water. Okay, there are some electrolytes, okay, and it's slightly acidic. Okay, it contains protein mucin, which is it's a substance in our saliva that has a lubricating, wetting, or softening effect. It helps to protect the oral tissues and helps enhance mastication as well as our ability to speak. Okay, it actually has an antibacterial effect that is not often discussed. And finally, we have the salivary amylase that we just discussed. There's also lingual lipase for initiating the breakdown of lipids. Finally, we have a multitude of other things like lysozyme, immunoglobulin A, IgA, defensins, and nitric oxide, which all helps to protect our body against microorganisms that are ingested along with the food. Up to 1,500 milliliters of saliva can be produced each day. Of course, that value can range depending on the individual and the food that we're exposed to and other factors. And in terms of control of salivation, there are 3 salivary glands or major salivary glands: the parotid gland, submandibular gland, and the sublingual gland. Okay, so we could see sublingual is under the tongue, parotid gland just in front of your ear. Okay, and then the submandibular gland is under the mandible, as its name implies. Okay, and in terms of the control of salivation, this is activated by increase in parasympathetic activity. Okay, and is inhibited by sympathetic activity. That means when you're nervous, that's why there's decreased salivation and you experience dry mouth. But when you are in a relaxed state, more of that parasympathetic activity means that ingested food will stimulate chemo as well as mechanoreceptors in your mouth. That signal is then relayed to the brainstem, which then transfer to increase in parasympathetic activity, okay, leading to increase in salivation. Other stimuli can also play a role in salivation. You may have experienced watery mouth when you smell lemon or when you see delicious food, right? You start salivating without realizing, okay? And that 1,500 milliliters, much of it is swallowed. That's why you don't realize how much of the volume is produced each day. So the digestive functions performed our mouth are multifold. There's ingestion, which is eating. There's also mastication, which is carried out by our teeth, as well as a set of muscles of mastication, including temporalis muscle, masseter muscle, which you may have studied during anatomy. Okay. The tongue helps with mixing the saliva to form a food bolus. It also helps mixing the food substance with the enzyme in our saliva, thereby enhancing the speed of chemical digestion. Okay. So teeth, tongue mostly help out with mechanical breakdown. Okay. There's also transport of food to digestive tract. So when you swallow, okay, the saliva helps lubricate the bolus, and then your tongue helps push that food bolus down into your esophagus. That's transport of food into digestive tract. Okay, even though mouth itself is actually part of the digestive tract as well. Okay, and inside the mouth, our digestion actually begins, meaning the chemical breakdown begins, especially with carbohydrate as well as lipids, okay, using amylase and lipase. Moving on to pharynx and esophagus. So within our pharynx, the oropharynx and laryngopharynx, which are the second and third segments of the pharynx, is seen as a common passageway for food/fluid as well as air, whereas nasopharynx is reserved for air only. Okay, and once in a while, when you accidentally get food stuck in the nasopharynx, there is a very uncomfortable feeling that you may get, which I'm sure all of you have experienced. Oropharynx and laryngopharynx being shared passageway for food and air, it has to be built to withstand abrasion, okay, that the food substance imposes on the wall of that passage. And so that means these regions are lined with your stratified squamous epithelium, the non-keratinized type, right? If you recall from anatomy. So multiple layers of squamous cells allow these muscular tubes to withstand abrasion. And these parts of the pharynx also perform muscular contractions that propel the food further down into the esophagus. The esophagus is simply a muscular tube that allows for passage of food and fluids into the stomach. Okay, so the esophagus, and unlike small intestine, large intestine, our esophagus has no digestive or absorptive role. Okay, so it doesn't secrete anything for chemical breakdown of food. It doesn't absorb any nutrients, and it doesn't help mechanical breakdown of food. It simply passes the food from the back of your mouth, okay, or the oropharynx and laryngopharynx down into the stomach. Now, lower down, before you reach the stomach, we have the gastroesophageal sphincter, also known by the name of lower esophageal sphincter, LES. And this is a sphincter that prevents, when it's functioning properly, it prevents stomach acid from refluxing into our esophagus. But in patients who have acid reflux or heartburn, right, there's something wrong with the lower esophageal sphincter. Either it's displaced, not closing properly, or other reasons, in which cases the acid can reflux into the esophagus and damage the walls of the esophagus. Let's now take a look at the process of deglutition, which is swallowing. The first phase of swallowing is the buccal phase, and this involves the voluntary movement of your tongue, pressing against your hard palate and forcing food backwards into the oropharynx. Okay, and at this point in time, your upper esophageal sphincter is closed. Following the buccal phase, we move on to a lengthier phase called the pharyngeal esophageal phase. And in the first part of this longer phase, okay, the food is squeezed through the pharynx into the esophagus. Okay, and this involves an involuntary reflex. It's not, so once your food passes the buccal phase and enters into the back of your throat, this part becomes involuntary. Okay, it's a reflex. And at this point in time, the tongue blocks off the mouth and preventing more food from also entering into that pharynx, along with the already existing bolus. At this point in time, your soft palate and uvula also rise, and to seal off the nasal pharynx, preventing food from entering into the nasal cavity. Furthermore, the epiglottis seals off the larynx, preventing food from entering into the windpipe, into your trachea. And then following all that, the upper esophageal sphincter then opens, allowing food to move further down the esophagus. So following all that, the pharyngeal constrictor muscles now, because they surround your pharynx, they now contract to force bolus to descend further down the esophagus. Okay, and once the food passes through it, the upper esophageal sphincter then contracts to close off the esophagus from the pharynx. Once that food bolus has entered into the esophagus, there is a peristaltic wave, a wave of peristalsis passing through the wall of your esophagus that forces bolus to travel down into your stomach. And in this last phase of the pharyngeal esophageal phase, the lower esophageal sphincter opens to allow the bolus to pass into the stomach. And then the lower esophageal sphincter then closes off to prevent regurgitation of that substance along with acid in stomach back into the esophagus. Now, a quick distinction between anatomical versus functional or physiological sphincters. Anatomical sphincters, they work by contracting a thickened ring of muscle, And this thickened ring of muscle is generally visible with naked eye, no matter what state the sphincter is in, and it can be identified during an exam. So an example of that is our pyloric sphincter that separates the lumen of your stomach from the lumen of your small intestine. On the other hand, a functional sphincter or physiological sphincter, these don't have the same thickened muscular ring. They still have a circular muscle that constricts either around or inside them, but because it's not thickened, that specialized structure cannot be visually identified as a sphincter unless it's constricted. And when it's relaxed, it looks like just like the rest of the surrounding tissue, okay? So an example of this is the gastroesophageal sphincter, also known as lower esophageal sphincter. If your lower esophageal sphincter doesn't stay contracted, this can lead to a condition known as heartburn. And the technical term for this is gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. In other words, heartburn really has nothing to do with heart. It may feel like a sensation, burning sensation near your heart, but it has nothing to do with the heart. And this condition can be worsened when you're breathing in during inspiration. Okay? And this is because when you're breathing in, there is a fall in your intrapleural pressure, so the pressure within your pleural space. And that leads to an expansion of the esophagus, which then creates a subatmospheric pressure inside the esophagus. Okay, and that means the pressure inside the esophagus is now relatively lower than the pressure within your stomach. And so that creates a suction effect that pulls the gastric juice into the esophagus, especially if that lower esophageal sphincter wasn't closed. Okay. And so some of the causes for this GERD is eating too much, drinking too much, factors that pushes the stomach superiorly, including pregnancy, extreme obesity, running, also a condition known as hiatal hernia, which is where the stomach actually protrudes above the diaphragm, because typically the diaphragm separates the esophagus from the stomach. But in hiatal hernia, you actually see part of the stomach squeezes through above the diaphragm. Okay, so that can elevate the risk for having GERD. Now, the chronic consequences of heartburn or GERD is more serious than the short term. In short term, it increases the risk of esophagitis, which is just inflammation within the wall of within the lining of your esophagus. And it can also lead to esophageal sphincter, esophageal ulcer over time. And but if you were to have chronic recurrence of this, especially chronic ulcers, then it can eventually lead to esophageal cancer. Okay, and the treatment for this condition is mostly through lifestyle modification mixed with a dietary modification, and also in conjunction with antacids and proton pump inhibitors.